What is going on, YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the 13th album by new metal band Korn. Basically, this project is called The Nothing, and it came out in the late summer of 2019. Now, this is a pretty hit album here. This was kind of somewhat of a big deal for Korn just because it kind of brought them back. This was kind of a resurgence album for Korn. It just did some damage. This is one that the critics particularly enjoyed pretty well. I'd have to say it was a big deal at the time just because Korn was kind of in like a lagging somewhat, just because Korn somewhat had lagging stages in like the early 2010s as far as that pitch kind of happened. But I would have to say that the Paradigm Shift was a pretty solid album. I definitely enjoyed that one. But I would have to say I think I liked the Nothing more than the Paradigm Shift. But back in 2016, I reviewed their back in 2016. I reviewed Korn's 2016 album, The Serenity of Suffering, which was a resurgence in Korn as far as that particular pitch kind of happened. That definitely got them back into the spotlight pretty well. But then this album did a good job with that also. I think I gave Serenity of Suffering like a 10 out of 10, but this album's not going to get a 10 out of 10, but it's going to get pretty close. I'd have to say it's a good pitch to kind of have it, but I definitely feel like the singles on this particular album are very outstanding. There's definitely an inspired chord on here, and I would have to say that these are pretty shrill type singles. It's kind of a mismatch for the rest of the album because I feel like the singles on the Nothing album by Korn are particularly pretty shrill and just overall haunting in like a good assorted sense. But a lot of this is just more standard kind of basic metal and more makeshift kind of metal. It's actually interesting. The good portion of this album is pretty much in a makeshift kind of sense, just for like some wintry kind of brush. 3 out of 4 singles on this particular album kind of have a wintry brush about them. I'd have to suppose it's an interesting concept that Korn wasn't focused on summer as much on this particular album. It's just some good assortments of things that kind of happen on here. It's just a different taste of an album. It's just a different taste of an album for Korn, just because the makeshift kind of appeal of this particular project is different. I do feel like there's some haunting kind of vibes on this particular album. It does have some metal sense. It's not quite as gleaming and as glimmering as as album. It's not quite as gleaming and as glimmering as albums like Issues and The Serenity of Suffering as far as that pitch kind of particularly happens with it. But it's also a little bit. It's pretty much like a album that's pretty similar, kind of in between. Even though I don't remember the Untouchables that much, I do at least remember the singles off that particular album. It kind of feels like a late 2010s version of like the Untouchables, and a little bit of Take a Look in the Mirror with like traces of like Issues in there. I'd have to suppose it doesn't really remind me of Life is Peachy or Korn from 1994, but I would have to say it's just a good concept to kind of get some of this because it does have some metal prone type stuff with some wintry brushes in there for like some makeshift kind of edge for just like the colder weather and the colder seasons as far as that pitch kind of happens. And then it just kind of has like the typical kind of ghastly, and then it just has like the typical kind of ghastly feel that Core normally has. So this is a short album. There's really only 10 full-blown songs on here. There's like 3 kind of short, less than 2 minute interlude type songs, or one song that's 2.5 minutes, but the other 2 songs are less than 2 minutes as far as that pitch kind of happens with this. I'd have to suppose those are a little bit shorter. I'm not going to knock. I would have to say it kind of makes the full blown experience of this particular album a little bit snappier than what I realized years ago. Back in 2019, I was really excited for this particular album. I never got around to reviewing it back in 2019, but it's something that I was really kind of hung up on. I really enjoyed this album quite a bit back in 2019. That kind of delayed me from wanting to review it because I didn't want this album to not live up to the hype. I always liked the singles off this album, and I remember hearing them on the radio, but I just never got around to this album. I've owned it for quite a while, but it's just kind of the concept that today is the time to finally get to this particular project as far as that pitch kind of happens. But luckily, it does live up to the hype, and it's pretty outstanding. It's just kind of a mismanagement just because the singles are different from the rest of the album just in terms of the pitch. But we'll go into that, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So basically, there were 4 singles off this particular album, 3 of which were official singles, 1 of which was just a promotional single. So the first single was You'll Never Find Me. This is one that came out when I was hyped about the album in the summer of 2019. I'd have to suppose this is basically like a deranged kind of desolate new metal gem. I'd have to say that feels like ruin. And this song just feels like ruin. I'd have to say definitely like the ruin type feel of this particular. And I use the word ruin in like a good sense. It definitely has that ruin type feel. Just something that this feels desolate and destroyed as far as that pitch kind of happens. It's a real excellent kind of instrumental and band work as far as this particular pitch on this song particularly kind of happens. It's an excellent one. This is revitalized Korn. Definitely like the concept of a pretty good feels. This is like a classic kind of haunting Korn. This is definitely like some classic kind of haunting Korn, I'd have to say, and this is just an overall superb song. It's definitely them just completely got their second win back in inspiration as far as that pitch kind of happens. This is a very inspired Korn, would have to suppose. This real malaise. This completely outdoes the singles off of like The Serenity of Suffering. And pretty much this is probably one of the best songs out of the 2010s decade from Korn as far as that pitch kind of happens. And I'd probably even say out of the 2020s, considering that this came out with 3 months left in the 2010s as far as that pitch kind of happens with it. It was just an overall excellent song. Very hooky, very affable. Just the band work is excellent on here. Very haunting song. The second single was Cold, but this was more of a promotional single, but I still enjoy this one. This is like a brisk kind of grim metal. This is like a brisk kind of grim metal relative makeshift bop. I'd have to say pretty good concept for that. This is like a good companion piece to Can You Hear Me? I would definitely have to suppose. Pretty good concept for that. And this is just like a wintry brush for work, I'd have to suppose. So I definitely appreciate this one. Great song to hear after like the second half of October to about the first couple weeks in March or even a little bit of April. I'd have to suppose just some good wintry brush to kind of have just for like the colder seasons. Just a good pitch to kind of have that. Just real. I mean, this is kind of a manic type metal type song. This one's a little bit more of like Slipknot type feels just within the chorus and stuff like that, and the bridge of like the verses in between the chorus. I'd have to say it's a good concept. This is kind of more manic type Korn, but it does have like some decent kind of commercial rock type feels about it just within I mean, this is affable to like the radio, but it's just kind of the concept that they do their normal band work and craziness that they're known for. So you get like the turn up without them being watered down as far as that pitch kind of happens with it. So it's a pretty good concept of a pretty rock solid single. Definitely one of their best. This is another of their better ones in recent times, even though you'll never find me as like the clear banner, even though you'll never find me as like the clear kind of banner highlight on this particular album. But Cold is still pretty good. It's pretty solid follow up. I feel like Cold's pretty much a better pair up with Can You Hear Me, which is the third single, but the second official single. This is a pretty highlighted one. This is definitely kind of like a bristling, kind of colder, wintry brush of a metal highlight of a song, I'd have to say. Definitely enjoyed this one. This is like a stretching, kind of grim makeshift. This is definitely some stretching, grim makeshift for the Cold. I would have to feel like this is just an overall pretty highlighted song. This is definitely one of the more defining Korn songs of the winter. This is definitely one of the more defining Korn songs of the winter. I'd have to say I can't think of too many Korn songs that I can think off I can't think of too many Korn songs off the top of my dome that just have like this stretching kind of winter appeal as far as that pitch kind of happens with it. Just a good concept to kind of hear for like the colder weather. Definitely some November, December type music and January stuff like that as far as that pitch kind of happens. Just a real nice one. Perfect little pitch that Korn kind of had for this single to kind of brush off. Perfect little single for this album to continue the cycle of the album promotion as far as that pitch kind of happen with it. This is definitely a highlight back in the early COVID days of early 2020 as far as that pitch kind of happened. Just kind of an easy highlight and one that I do enjoy hearing when it pops up on the radio. So it's a pretty nice one to kind of get. And that's another highlight for Korn. This is a good 1-2 punch in terms of singles that are mainstream to radio as far as that pitch kind of happens. And then finally, Free is the third official single, but it was actually the fourth single. But this is a song I don't remember hearing on the radio as far as that pitch kind of happens. I kind of quit paying attention more to rock radio around this particular time. But this one came out real late in the album cycle. I was surprised that this one came out. I checked the album cycle of this particular album on Wikipedia for the longest time, and it just never showed up until and this song didn't show up as a single until October 2020. So it was over a year after this album came out that this song was finally released as a single, which was pretty interesting just because I did support this album for a good length of time into 2020, but eventually it just kind of this single finally came out, which is interesting. I did not know much about this one. I haven't heard this one on the radio, at least not to my knowledge, but it is a pretty nice song, I'd have to say. It's like a hazy kind of winter sun bristle of a song, I would have to suppose. This feels like a churchy kind of a tone-like song. I would definitely feel like something of like Van Helsing and End of Days type manner. I would have to suppose just those sorts of movies, some of those type pitches. This song has character and it's a pretty good offhanded late single of Korn, I'd have to say. So I definitely enjoyed this one. Basically, all three of the singles on this particular album are pretty highlighted just in terms of the Korn sense. They were definitely pretty inspired. On this particular album, which is pretty awesome just because it's just kind of highlighted out of nowhere. The fact that they were about 25 years old by this particular point, by the time this album particularly kind of came out, just the fact that they still had some energy and spark to put out another highlighted album is definitely pretty good. I feel like this one's up there. I mean, some of my favorite albums by Korn would be The Serenity of Suffering, Issues. Definitely like Life is Peachy and Follow the Leader. Korn from 1994 is still pretty good. Take a Look in the Mirror. Take a Look in the Mirror is pretty underrated along with the Paradigm Shift. I'd have to suppose there's just a lot of good ones that kind of have that particular concept. It's just an interesting aspect to kind of get Korn kind of inspired in some of these pitches. I kind of lost the point that I was talking about. It's just kind of forgot the pitch of the point that I was trying to say, but I would have to suppose it's basically just Korn being inspired 25 years later and still managing to pump out some of these highlights just in terms of the pitch of just being able to do it with overall quality. So it's a good concept. Definitely appreciate these concepts. This is definitely one of the better Korn albums of like the second half of their career as far as that pitch kind of happens. Just like the aspect behind it, definitely pretty appreciative. So, but yeah, so there's basically There's 13 songs on this particular album, and out of those 13, I wound up recommending to you 9. So the only four songs I didn't recommend would just be The End Begins, Idiosyncrasy, The Seduction of Indulgence, and Harder. So basically, to talk about some of these, like I really didn't like the instrumentation on Seduction of Indulgence, and it was the same thing with The End Begins. These were just kind of two shorter songs that just didn't add up to much. They were kind of, I just feel like the band work on those particular two songs just didn't really add up to much in terms of like the compellingness. These were just kind of some snag kind of songs. I would have preferred like a little bit lengthier songs that would have been more like the singles in terms of more typical kind of haunting Korn. But The End Begins really reminds me of like Shoots and Ladders. Has those same kind of bagpipes that song had way back in 1994. It's a good concept for some sort of nostalgia, but it just didn't deliver quite as well in terms of having the quality of it. And then Harder was just kind of a poor one. Didn't really like the Harder had some decent kind of electro instrumentation, but was just not a compelling enough one to really draw much attention as far as I was concerned with that particular pitch of it. And then Idiosyncrasy was just kind of a chugging along, kind of typical power ballad that just was kind of like a stadium number that just didn't pull it off that well. It's just kind of it's just kind of a usual and typical type fare that just didn't pull off the vibes as normally well as it probably needed to for like those type of power ballads and stuff like that. I'd have to suppose it's just kind of the pitch about that particular one. So to talk about some of the highlights on this particular album, which there are quite a bit on here, I would have to say a particular one that does a great job on here would be Gravity of Discomfort. This is a real nice one. This is like a stellar kind of backyard turn up of a song, I'd have to say. It's like a manic kind of distorted haze of a song, definitely, and it's a smoke one kind of tune, definitely some smokish to kind of have for this particular song. It's a very hooky type tune, I would have to suppose, and this song just exudes kind of swag, I'd have to say. So it's a pretty good song. This song definitely has some charisma and overall character, typical kind of Korn fashion as far as that pitch kind of happens. This is kind of a haunting song, but it's just not as distinctly haunting as like they're normally known for. Like the stuff that they were doing on like Issues and Serenity of Suffering and some of those type ones and Life is Peachy, some of those more gleaming type albums. This is a lot more kind of more manic, kind of more band work type stuff. More so, it's a lot more manic, kind of more band work type stuff, more so than the normal distorted and kind of more haunting type feels. I'd have to say it's still pretty nice one. It's just kind of more of like take a look in the mirror type sense and Untouchables type sense more so than like Serenity of Suffering and Issues. It's still a pretty nice one, but it's just kind of not. It's a great song. It's a great song, but it just kind of has a different pitch in terms of its immediacy. It's just kind of like Korn goes through these cycles of just having differential type ones. This one's not as much of autumn music, I'd have to say. It's kind of some of these just feel like more summer turn up, reminiscent of like Take a Look in the Mirror type days and a little bit of Untouchables, I'd have to suppose. That's a pretty good concept for that. This Loss is another highlight, I'd have to suppose. This Loss is a pretty highlighted one. This is like a haunting kind of looming hangout song, I'd have to suppose. This is like a Spark One gem by Spark One. I mean, Spark a Few Blunts, some stuff like that, definitely. This is like classic Korn with like some hazy vibes about it, I'd have to say, and it's like a basic kind of evening smash hit. So I definitely appreciate this particular song. Just does a lot of damage on here, just pretty much. The song does a lot of damage on here. This is another highlighted type one, but once again, this is more metal and band work type stuff, more so than the kind of glimmering type stuff that more so than like the glimmering type stuff of like the Serenity of Suffering, just the previous album, I'd have to say. So it's a concept about that, but I do particularly like some of these. It's basically like if Serenity of Suffering was like a revamp of like the I'd say if the Serenity of Suffering was like a revamp of like Issues from 1999, I'd probably say that like this particular album is like a revamp of like Take a Look in the Mirror. And I think I said this before earlier in the review, but I'd say it's like a revamp of like Take a Look in the Mirror with like a little bit of like Untouchables in there. Like I still, like I was saying, I don't remember the Untouchables that well, but I would have to say it definitely reminds me of like Take a Look in the Mirror, just that kind of summer haze and just kind of overall or backyard kind of summer party stuff like that. It's not this is not as much of like an autumn album. I feel like the singles are kind of made in the winter and stuff like that, but the album cuts on here just have a lot more kind of summer haze just within the pitch of just kind of being a lot more hangout type music and just kind of more kickback. Just interesting. At least Gravity of Discomfort and This Loss kind of do that. Another one that kind of does that is the Ringmaster. This is a pretty highlighted one. This one definitely reminds me of Take a Look in the Mirror days, I'd have to say. It's like a snappy kind of riveting guitar work that this song particularly kind of has. This should really take you back to like Take a Look in the Mirror. I don't remember which single that particularly reminds me of, but it's one of those ones off that 2003 album that the riff on the Ringmasters is very similar to that particular album from 2003. It's a pretty good pitch to kind of get that one. This is like a stark and grim type bop. I would definitely have to feel like it's a pretty nice one. So 3 songs off this particular album definitely remind me of Take a Look in the Mirror. It's pretty good pitch. Definitely some backyard summer haze as far as that pitch kind of happens, but this is not, like I was saying, this is not as much autumn music, but it is some pretty good concepts to kind of get this. Another song that reminds me of You'll Never Find Me is The Darkness Is Revealing. Definitely appreciate this one. This is like a more manic version of You'll Never Find Me. I would definitely feel like this is like a typical kind of head case Korn vibes that this song particularly kind of has, and this is just some turn up kind of fun. The Darkness is Revealing is definitely like a more hangout type version of You'll Never Find Me. It's definitely a little bit more manic of one. It's also more ground level, I'd have to suppose. Pretty good concept to get that particular one as far as that pitch kind of happens with it. It's just a great concept on that particular song. Really has some affability about it. These are just some great ones. So it's just kind of like a revamp of getting like the late 2010s, early 2020s version of like Take a Look in the Mirror type days, but it's just kind of the concept of getting some of these hangout type numbers and just kind of more manic. I mean, they very much still have like their manic and kind of feral type feel. It's a good concept to kind of get some of these deranged type ones just within the pitch. Definitely reminds me of like this album has like the ghastliness along with like the typical kind of creeping type fare of like a normal kind of Korn type album, just within the pitch of kind of having that just within the fashion of like Take a Look in the Mirror from like the 2000s, the early 2000s, as far as that pitch kind of particularly kind of has with it. So it's a good concept to particularly kind of get that one. Plenty of good summer backyard type haze as far as that pitch kind of happens. These are some great kind of hangout type tunes, PlayStation type music, smoke a few stogies and stuff like that. Get some Subway, Burger King, some of those type pitches as far as those kind of particular things kind of happen. Typical kind of fanfare as far as that would kind of go. Just the band work is a lot more manic. I feel like it's just more bristled and kind of manic and jittery as far as that pitch kind of happens. But these are still some pretty gnarled summer carnage of songs to kind of have. And then the Surrender to Failure. The outro is a pretty nice one. Also, this is like an emphatic kind of feral wilderness spook of a song. I'd have to say it's like a stadium like bravado that this song particularly kind of has in like a creeping sense. So the song has stadium like bravado and like a creeping sense. So I'd have to say about this particular one. This is another feral one. This is pretty feral, kind of similar to like You'll Never Find Me and like The Darkness is Revealing. I'd have to suppose it's interesting that Korn kind of got more wild on this particular album. They just have a lot more feral kind of craziness. Normally they're more of like a head case kind of just manic type feel like they are on like Life is Peachy and Korn from 1994. Some of those type ones. It's kind of more of like head case type music and more ghastliness. But some of these there's actually some kind of wilderness type ones that just feel very feral and just kind of eviscerative as far as that pitch kind of happens. It's a good concept kind of get some of these. This is very much like a stadium type song. It has some of that. It's just kind of a wild and crazy type song. It has the crazy factor, but it just kind of has it in a more feral kind of sense as far as that pitch kind of happens. But then it's also kind of spooky as well. This is kind of one of the few autumn type songs on this particular album. It's just an interesting pitch to kind of get some of this. This one kind of feels different from the rest of the album, I would have to suppose, apart from like maybe You'll Never Find Me. But even that, it's not quite as feral as this particular song, I'd have to suppose. So it's an interesting concept, decent outro here. There's a couple songs on this particular album where John Davis actually cries on here. I think it just adds to like the craziness of this particular album. I want to say that he also cries on like The End Begins and he cries on Surrender to Failure. So it's an interesting kind of extra pitch to kind of see some of these on this particular album. It's just a great concept. So we look after this. This is a pretty haunting. This is a grim album. Definitely appreciate the appeal of this. So me recommending 9 songs out of 13 on this particular album. I'm gonna go ahead and give this album like a 9 out of 10. This has some pretty sheer quality on here. Definitely reminds me of Take a Look in the Mirror, which is a pretty good concept. That one's kind of an overlooked album, not as commonly talked about for Korn, but it's just interesting that this is such an offhanded and roundabout type album that just kind of has like a widespread amount of things on here, but it's just a different pitch overall from like the usual Korn that some of their more highlighted type ones are known for. Like some of their biggest albums, like some of Korn's biggest albums, the Nothing album just really doesn't sound similar to those at all, I'd have to suppose. Just an interesting kind of pitch that this is kind of a more roundabout type album that just kind of has some, it's just a more roundabout type album that just kind of has some backhanded and kind of offhanded type pitches that work pretty well. It's just like a 2010s revamp of like some summer backyard kind of carnage and stuff like that, along with some wintry brush kind of singles to kind of have for like some winter makeshift as far as that pitch kind of happens. So it's just some great concepts. Definitely have to say the makeshift kind of appeal works on it. The social score, I'm going to go ahead and give the social score like a 9.75 out of 10. I feel like if they wouldn't have waited until way out in October 2020 to put out Finally Free, which I like the concept just because that's kind of a wintry song also, but it's just kind of one that I just didn't see coming. It was just kind of one that took a while. The promotion of this album was particularly kind of here and there, at least in 2019 and early 2020, it had a good pitch of like pretty solid bravado promotion on here. And they do have some pretty good social type tunes for Smokage and Snackage and stuff like that, I'd have to say. It was just kind of the concept. I don't know. I just feel like it just missed it by like a small notch as far as being like a perfect score in terms of the social score. I mean, it's a pretty damn good album, I'd have to suppose, but it just kind of feels offhanded just because it doesn't have their normal haunting type fare, and it just maybe lacked like a song. It's a short album on top of that, and it just maybe lacked like at least 1 or 2 songs that could have had their typical kind of autumn music of like haunting fare from Korn as far as that pitch kind of happens. But this is still pretty eviscerative type album. Just needed like maybe a song or 2 more to help bolster it just within like the sheer impact of it. It's just kind of a brief one. So in terms of the future especially like Korn put out an album in early 2022 called Requiem, which is a pretty great concept. I'm gonna have to check out that particular one. But there's only a few more Korn albums to particularly kind of get to, so we'll get to some more of these. But this is definitely kind of a just roundabout kind of hit of an album that just works pretty damn well, I'd have to say. So it's one that I would have to highly recommend, and it's a pretty recent and pretty relatively relevant even today highlight from Korn that just has some good appeal about it.